Hello Year 12, welcome to Lesson 3 on Lenin and the Civil War, and today we are going to look at how the Bolsheviks dealt with their opponents during the first few months of Bolshevik rule. As usual, you need to get yourself ready for the lesson. You will need the table worksheet which you began to fill in last lesson. You'll need your knowledge organiser as well. Have a pen, have some A4 paper to do the activities and put any distractions away so you can really focus. Pause now and when you're ready, hit play. So first, it's your do now. Last lesson, we looked at how the Bolsheviks set up their new government. And so you have 5 quick recall questions to have a go at here. As usual, can you do this without your notes and without looking back at your knowledge organisers? Because we're trying to improve our memory and our recall here. When you're ready and you're done, press play again and we'll look at the answers. So here are the answers. If you got one of them wrong, don't panic, but I do want you to correct your answers in a different colour pen. And don't forget to give yourself a mark out of 5 at the end so you can see how well you did. When you've finished marking, hit play and we'll move forward. So at the moment, we are just in the early stages of our new topic, Lenin and the Civil War, and we're looking at the first few months of Bolshevik rule. Today we'll look at dealing with opposition. We're also going to touch on both of our big questions. So here's your starter task for the lesson. Over the last couple of lessons, we've introduced some new and quite complicated terminology. So to start today, I want you to match up these quite tricky key terms with the correct definitions. And when you're done, hit play and we'll check the answers. So here are the answers. How many did you get right? Pause now and mark your own work and then hit play when you're ready to go. And now you need your knowledge organiser handy because we're going to update it and I'll show you which bits of content we're going to cover in this lesson. So these are the main areas that we're going to touch on today, and I want you to highlight and update your own knowledge organiser to reflect that. I'm just going to point out to you here as well that in today's lesson we are going to touch on 2 of the reasons why the Bolsheviks survived as a government. We'll look at their ruthless methods and terror, and we'll also touch today on the weaknesses of their opponents. Pause now, update your knowledge organiser, and when you're ready, hit play. So today's lesson is how did the Bolsheviks deal with their opponents 1917 to 1918. We'll look at how the Bolsheviks dealt with early opposition across society, but we'll also see how the Bolsheviks dealt with opposition from the other socialist parties, the Mensheviks and the SRs. And towards the end of the lesson, we'll reflect on what we've done and we'll identify what evidence we've seen that the Bolsheviks were already building a dictatorship before the Civil War began. So, in the first months of Bolshevik rule, opposition to the Bolsheviks was actually quite weak. And I want you to think about why this was. So I need you to read page 119 in your textbook. And as you do this, I want you to record any reasons you can find why opposition to the Bolsheviks was weak in those early months. I want you to record those reasons in a table with 2 columns. On one side, actions which the Bolsheviks took which weakened their opposition. And on the other side of your table, other reasons why the opposition was weak. This is going to take you a little bit of time to do. You can do it in bullet points, but when you're done, hit play and I'm going to share with you some of my ideas. So here are the answers which I came up with, and I'm not going to read you through all of them, but I do want to pick up on a couple of points here which are really easy to miss. Hopefully you spotted that the Bolsheviks began to ban other parties, and they began by banning the Cadet Party, which was a right-wing party. The left-wing parties, the socialist parties like the SRs and the Mensheviks, they are not banned yet, but they're not entirely legal either. They're somewhere in between. So the leadership of the SRs and the Mensheviks began to be arrested, and that weakened them. But the Mensheviks and the SRs were not willing to get involved in any violent opposition to the Bolsheviks at this point, because they feared this would lead to a civil war, which they wanted to avoid. And in any case, the Bolsheviks and the SRs were pinning their hopes on the arrival of the Constituent Assembly. And they expected that when the Constituent Assembly was called, it would draw up arrangements for the future government of Russia, and that would be a coalition government where all the socialist parties would work together. Another reason why opposition to the Bolsheviks was weak was that workers and soldiers were distracted. They were busy carrying out their frustrations against the middle classes by looting and attacking them. And the Bolsheviks encouraged this and legalized it. They encouraged workers and soldiers to take out their anger against anybody who was labelled a bourgeois. Now that word bourgeois means bourgeois, but actually it applied to anybody who the workers and soldiers blamed for their problems. So that could be a wealthy middle class person in the street, but it could equally be a priest or a teacher or a civil servant, a merchant, a business owner, a slightly wealthier peasant. Anybody could be labelled a bourgeois, and they could be beaten up in the street, have their belongings taken, their homes burgled, and it was entirely legal to do this. And the Bolsheviks deliberately encouraged this as a way of diverting workers and soldiers and as a way of winning their support. If you need to add things now to your notes, can you pause the video and when you're ready to move forward, hit play. Now, in the previous activity, you will have noticed that the Bolsheviks set up their own secret police force in this period called the Cheka. It was the Bolshevik equivalent of the Okhrana, the old Tsarist police force. But the Cheka was far better organised. It was led by this man, Dzerzhinsky, and he was particularly remorseless and ruthless. He was a Polish aristocrat with a pathological hate of his own social class. He operated without compassion and without remorse, and that's why Lenin chose him to lead the Cheka. Now, at first, in these early months, the Cheka's reach was very, very limited. They only really operated in Petrograd, and they only had about 120 employees. But during the Civil War, we'll see later that the Cheka expands. Another really important thing to mention about the Cheka is that it was only answerable to Lenin. It was not under the control of the party's central committee. It wasn't under the control of the Soviets. It was Lenin's personal tool. And I'm going to give you a source now, which comes from Brzezinski himself. This was his first speech as head of the Cheka in December of 1917. I want you to do a short task with this source. I want you to pause the video and read this extract from his speech. And I want you to think about this question. What can we learn here? What does it reveal about the Cheka and about the way it operated? And if you can, I'd like you to try and come up with 3 or 4 inferences from the source of your own. When you've done that, hit play and we'll share some answers. Let's look at some inferences which you could have made about the Cheka based on this source. Firstly, we can infer that the Cheka was a real priority for the Bolsheviks. It was up and running within the first couple of months of Bolshevik rule. So the Bolsheviks had begun to create the machinery of terror before the Civil War had even begun. We also get a sense here that the Cheka was created because the Bolsheviks felt under threat from their opponents, and there's a sense in the source that their grip on power was insecure. He says, "Our revolution is in serious danger." Now, the Bolsheviks were aware that left-wing parties had a reputation of being thinkers and talkers, but not doers, and they wanted to move quickly to tackle potential opponents to their new regime. Brzezinski mentions the use of the revolutionary sword, and in fact Lenin referred to the Cheka as the sword of the proletariat, and we get a sense there that the Cheka is going to use brutal and violent methods. It used arrest, torture and execution. The source also reveals, in phrases such as "we have no need for justice" and "do not demand evidence to prove," this reveals to us that the Cheka operated outside the law. Basic rules of evidence and proof and fair trials, those things did not apply. In other words, the Cheka wielded arbitrary power. It was unrestrained by the law. The source reveals that the Cheka's mission was class warfare, to terrorise and eliminate the bourgeoisie. And remember, that was part of Lenin's vision of the dictatorship of the proletariat. He viewed this as a stage during which all traces of bourgeois influence would be wiped out of society using force. So in this particular source, when it describes a prisoner who's been arrested by the Cheka, Dzerzhinsky reminds the Cheka that their first duty is to ask what social class the prisoner is from, and if he's bourgeois, then he's guilty. But we also get a sense here that the Cheka's scope is much broader than just targeting the bourgeoisie. Dzerzhinsky says that the Cheka will put an end to all counter-revolutionaries, and that's quite an elastic term. You could stretch that term to cover anybody who opposed the Bolshevik leadership, not just right-wing parties, not just bourgeois elements in society, but also left-wing opponents. So the Cheka had scope to target anyone who opposed the new Bolshevik regime. In the next part of the lesson, we're going to focus on opposition to the Bolsheviks from the other socialist parties like the Mensheviks and the SRs. Now, the threat to Lenin's new government from these parties came on two fronts. Firstly, pressure to form a coalition, and secondly, the Constituent Assembly, which was scheduled to meet in January of 1918. And I'm going to talk to you about both of these. Firstly, pressure to form a coalition. When the Bolsheviks first seized power, they came under sustained pressure to form a coalition government. Resolutions and petitions came flooding into Petrograd from factory committees, from soldiers' committees, and from towns, demanding that the socialist parties put aside their differences and work together. In the eyes of many workers and soldiers, squabbling and bickering between socialist parties was seen as a betrayal of the revolution. And Lenin also came under pressure from within his own party. Other leading Bolsheviks, like Kamenev and Zinoviev, warned Lenin that unless he ruled in a coalition, then the Bolsheviks would have to rule by force. Now, Lenin had no intention of forming a coalition government, but his position at this point was not strong enough to refuse coalition talks. Why was this? There were two factors which weakened Lenin's position. Firstly, the Railway Workers' Union threatened to strike if the Bolsheviks did not join coalition talks. That strike would stop grain supplies reaching the cities, and that would likely bring the Bolshevik government down. And secondly, in order to survive as a government, the Bolsheviks had to take control of other key cities. But at this point, the Bolsheviks had only managed to seize control of Petrograd. Bolsheviks in Moscow were still struggling to take control of the city against forces loyal to the provisional government, who had the upper hand. So at this point in time, Lenin's position is not strong enough to reject the idea of a coalition. He has to go along with it. Lenin's solution was to send a team of 5 Bolsheviks, including Kamenev and Zinoviev, to take part in coalition talks. When the talks began, the Mensheviks and SRs offered to form a coalition with the Bolsheviks, on the condition that Lenin and Trotsky would be excluded from that coalition government. While this was happening, Lenin deliberately sabotaged the talks, leading to their collapse. How did he do this? Firstly, he made unreasonable demands. He demanded that 75% of the coalition government should be made up of Bolsheviks, and this was a term which the Mensheviks and SRs could never agree to. Secondly, Bolshevik sailors, beat up and murdered 2 SR leaders, leading to the SRs withdrawing from coalition discussions. Lenin then made an alliance with the left SRs, the more radical wing of the SR party, bringing 7 of them into the Sovnarkom, and they became junior partners in the new government. This episode had some notable consequences for Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. Firstly, it created some splits within the party. Kamenev and Zinoviev and Rykov were furious with Lenin for sabotaging the coalition talks, and Lenin dealt with them ruthlessly. He forced them to resign from the Central Committee, along with all of their supporters. Now, their resignation didn't last for long. They soon pleaded with Lenin and were readmitted to the Central Committee. The second key consequence here was that by taking the left SRs into coalition, Lenin successfully managed to split the SR party, weakening one of his opponents. And lastly, because the SRs were traditionally a party which represented the peasantry, by taking some of the left SRs into the Sovnarkom, Lenin strengthened his claim that the new government represented both workers and peasants. Next, let's turn to the Constituent Assembly. By the time the Bolsheviks seized power, it was already too late to stop the elections for a Constituent Assembly, which was scheduled to happen in November of 1917. And in any case, calling them off would have led to a backlash against the Bolsheviks, particularly as Lenin had previously criticised the provisional government for not holding those elections quickly enough. The new Bolshevik government felt threatened by the Constituent Assembly. It was the most democratic elected body in Russian history, and it would have the legitimacy or authority to draw up a new constitution and government for Russia. And the Bolsheviks knew very well that they were unlikely to win a majority in that Constituent Assembly, and they were proved correct on this. When the results were counted, the Bolsheviks failed to win the elections. As you can see, I've given you the results of the elections. For each party, you can see the share of vote which they won and the number of seats they gained in the Constituent Assembly. The clear winner here was the SR party, and that reflected the fact that the vast majority of the Russian population were peasants. The Bolsheviks came a distant second, although they had gained most of the support in urban areas. So how did Lenin deal with the Constituent Assembly? Firstly, before the Assembly even met, Lenin banned the Cadet Party so that they were unable to attend. Lenin knew that the Cadets would never authorise the new Bolshevik government. On the first day of the Assembly, the 5th of January 1918, a crowd of peaceful, unarmed demonstrators gathered in support of the Assembly. Lenin used the army to put down the crowd in the most brutal fashion. Soldiers hidden on rooftops opened fire on the unarmed demonstrators from machine guns. This was the first time which the army had been used to put down an unarmed protest since the days of the February Revolution, and it was reminiscent of the way in which the Tsarist government dealt with peaceful protests, such as Bloody Sunday. The Assembly was allowed to meet for just one day. The Red Guard watched the proceedings from the back of the hall. When the new Assembly refused to authorise the new Bolshevik government, the Red Guard sent the Assembly home, and they locked the doors of the building. This was the end of the Constituent Assembly. It never met again. Lenin justified these actions by claiming that the assembly itself was bourgeois and that it represented a step backward for the revolution. He claimed that the new Soviet democracy being set up by the Bolsheviks was superior to the bourgeois Constituent Assembly. The results of this episode were mixed for the Bolshevik Party. On the one hand, they had managed to get rid of the assembly relatively easily, as the SRs and Mensheviks refused to use force to defend it. However, by ridding themselves of the assembly in this way, the Bolsheviks had made absolutely clear that they were not going to share power, and that took them a step closer to dictatorship. And Lenin remarked to Trotsky that closing the assembly amounted to a complete and frank liquidation of the idea of democracy by the idea of dictatorship. The Bolsheviks' opponents now recognised that the Bolsheviks had no intention of sharing power, and that their hopes that the Constituent Assembly would create a democratic government were destroyed, and that made civil war more likely. Finally, the way in which the Constituent Assembly was crushed led to tensions within the Bolshevik Party. Some Bolsheviks felt increasingly uncomfortable about Lenin's ruthless and undemocratic approach. Now, the historian Sheila Fitzpatrick argues that the refusal to form a coalition and the closure of the Constituent Assembly was a defining moment in the development of the Bolshevik state. She says this: the Bolsheviks had chosen their direction, even if they had not decided how fast to travel. In other words, by refusing to form a coalition with the other socialist parties, and by closing down the Constituent Assembly, the Bolsheviks had now set themselves on a course which would lead to a dictatorship, even though perhaps they hadn't decided how quickly that dictatorship would be created. So you're ready to do a task now. I'd like you to find the table which you began to fill out last lesson, and you're ready now to complete the next 2 rows on it: opposition and other socialist parties. When you've done that, go back and look again at the predictions which you made at the start of last lesson, particularly predictions B, D and G. How accurate were your predictions? Did you get them right? Before we finish our lesson today, I want us to return to one of our big questions. Why did the Bolsheviks become dictators? Now remember, we made this diagram on features of the Bolshevik dictatorship, and we're currently looking to see when and why these features developed. We have 2 hypotheses on this. Firstly, hypothesis 1, that the Bolsheviks always intended to set up a dictatorship. And hypothesis 2, that the Bolsheviks didn't plan to set up a dictatorship. It was the civil war which made them do it. In this lesson, we've seen again that the Bolsheviks began to develop some of the features of dictatorship before the civil war even started. So you should be ready now to add a little bit more evidence to support hypothesis 1. In particular, you're going to need to think about the Cheka, coalition talks, the Constituent Assembly, and the way in which the Bolsheviks dealt with other parties and the press. And I'd like you to add more evidence now to that side of your table. And that brings us to the end of today's lesson. Well done, Year 12. Don't forget, if you haven't already done so, to subscribe to our YouTube channel And remember, you can watch any of the lesson videos again if you need to. Next lesson, we're going to look at how Lenin dealt with the problem of the war with Germany. So I'll look forward to teaching you then.